The Aeldari are what happens when mastery outruns wisdom. Once the galaxy's finest artisans, seers, and warriors, they tuned an entire civilization to sensation, and in doing so birthed their predator, she who thirsts. For them, death offers no release, only a pull into that god's hunger. Every custom answers that terror. The Asuryani live by narrow paths to keep any one desire from consuming the self. They wear spirit stones so their souls can join a craftworld's infinity circuit instead of Slaanesh. The Drukhari survive by siphoning agony from others. The Harlequins weaponize memory so the warning never fades. Prophets and radicals gather under Ynnari banners, wagering that awakening Ynnead, a god of the dead, might break the cycle. They are a culture now primed for caution. They fight like scholars under fire, fast, oblique, and economical, building with thought-responsive materials and wasting nothing, least of all lives. Extinction is not a distant fear but a daily pressure, and the question that governs them is brutally simple. Can a people who once rewrote reality discipline themselves long enough to survive its consequences? An empire does not collapse because one night grew too loud. It collapses because every quiet day before it taught people to expect satisfaction without cost. By the late golden age of the Eldar, abundance had become invisible. Distance meant nothing within the arteries of the webway. Famine was a problem solved so thoroughly it lived only in theater. Their psycho-reactive craft had reduced labor to composition. When a civilization exhausts all external limits, the only frontier left is the self. The Eldar crossed that frontier with the same brilliance they'd once reserved for terraforming, and they did it together. Billions of exquisite minds resonating through a medium that amplifies feeling, the warp. The signs of strain were cultural before they were apocalyptic. Cities that had been concert halls to the cosmos became sensoria, architectures tuned to magnify mood. Ritual and art, once ways to fix meaning in a long-lived society, drifted towards spectacle and escalation. The pursuit of heightened experience ceased to be a pastime and became the default grammar of life. Guilds of sensation emerged, not merely hedonist salons but philosophical schools whose curricula treated inhibition as an illness and transgression as health. Ethics did not vanish, they were reframed as private aesthetics. Eldar, with centuries behind them and more ahead, learned to treat consequence like an optional texture. Seers saw the pressure building in the immaterium and warned that every indulgence paid into a fund they did not want to mature. The warnings worked on a minority. Some clans and city-ships began a slow withdrawal, first from the densest urban cores, then from metropolitan life entirely. They commissioned great self-sufficient vessels that would later be known as craftworlds, not as war arcs but as moving polities with gardens, oceans, archives, and industries, each capable of reproducing the entire cycle of Eldar life without recourse to the Empire's centers. Others refused the premise and walked further. The Exodites left entirely for garden worlds, committing to austere lives in close covenant with their planetary world spirits, betting that intimacy with land would anchor them against the currents pulling their people apart. Between these responses lay the majority, confident, curious, and convinced they could ride the edge forever. Technologically, nothing failed. That is crucial. The webway still bore them safely. Wraithbone still grew under thought like coral guided by music. Medical art extended life and sensation in tandem. The pantheon that had coalesced out of their long psychic echo, Asuryani, Isha, Kurnis, Vol, Marae Heg, Cain, and the laughing trickster Segarak, remained vivid presences in myth and trance. The Eldar did not lose their gods, they made new context for them. Temples to war did not vanish, they were outnumbered by temples to novelty. Festivals became seasons, seasons became states of being. Hedonism alone does not doom a species. Hedonism in a species whose every emotion writes itself into the ether does. The Eldar were not merely feeling, they were broadcasting, harmonizing, feeding back. Each search for a more refined note of pleasure, a rarer shade of pain, a more delicate transgression contributed to a collective signal that the warp, true to its nature, reflected and amplified. The densest cores of the Empire, their cradle worlds, became engines of psychic pressure. Nobody flipped a switch, there was no singular architect. They were only perfect instruments, perfectly played for too long in one direction. There were pockets of resistance. Communities on the cusp of departure began to structure their lives as experiments in restraint, early informal versions of what would later harden into the path system. Where city life invited self to expand, these circles taught it to narrow, to become a tool for a time and then be set down. Craftworld Council set codes, rotated duties, and reintroduced meaning to work by binding it to identity. These were not reactionaries, they were conservationists of the soul, trying to adjust the pressure valve on a system the rest of the species still believed could never burst. The choices of those years would determine who lived to tell the story. The Empire did not fall like a palace collapsing, it inverted like a lung.
The region of space now known as the Eye of Terror was once home to the Aeldari Empire, a prideful, sensuous people. The Aeldari realized too late the perils of excess. The fourth chaos god Slaanesh was born from their debauchery, its coming heralded by a psychic scream that shook real space to its foundations and devastated the Aeldari. The Crone Worlds are all that remain of the Aeldari's fallen domain. They are blighted planets, consumed by the spreading unreality of the Eye of Terror, and twisted to new and nightmarish realities.
The end arrived as a beginning, an emergence rather than a strike. The gathered weight of Eldar emotion in the warp achieved critical mass. Where humans would later speak of chaos gods as if they'd always been, Slaanesh came into being at a moment and with a signature that cannot be mistaken. The consummate distillation of hunger for sensation, a consciousness born already fluent in the language that made it. When she who thirsts inhaled for the first time, Eldar souls across the heart worlds were the air. The event had layers. In the material galaxy, a wound opened that is not closed. The Eye of Terror, a permanent fusion of real space and immaterium, a storm glassed into geography. The worlds at the core of the Eldar Empire were dragged inward and transformed into Crone worlds, places where their greatest cities persisted as taunts, ruin and memory held in a pressure cooker of corruption. In the warp, the shock wave was annihilation and capture. Billions died not from blast or flame, but because the essential pattern that made them themselves was torn loose and devoured. Those on the peripheral worlds fell to their knees, alive but emptied, their spirits frayed by a tide they could feel but not resist. Those in the webway were spared the first instant by the old one's insulated roads, but even there the new gravity could be felt, pressure finds seams. The Pantheon reacted as only gods can in myth and metaphor that nonetheless bears the weight of truth. Kala Mensha Kane, the war god, fought the new hunger and was shattered, his being breaking into fragments that embedded themselves like hot iron seeds in those Eldar vessels and enclaves where war would later be called upon. That shattering is why an avatar can be roused on a craft world. Each is a shard of a god cooling for a time in iron. Zegarak did what tricksters do. He fled into the webway, laughing as he went, and in that flight, the Harlequins found their mandate, memory's custodians, dancers in a theatre now bound by catastrophe. Isha the Mother, in Eldar telling, came into the grasp of pestilence and learned too much in captivity. Even in myth, the story encodes a people's knowledge that care alone could not heal what had been unbound. In the material, consequences began to crystallize into practices that would define everything the Eldar have done since. The survivors understood that death no longer implied release. To die without preparation was to be taken, not by a natural entropy, but by an active appetite key to their species. The response was immediate invention and desperate archaeology. Psychoreactive crystals, waystones, cold spirit stones when bound to an individual became talismans and engines both. An Eldar who dies with a stone upon them is drawn into it rather than into the waiting mouth of Slaanesh. Those stones can be returned to an infinity circuit, an embedded wraithbone matrix that runs through every craft world like a nervous system, where the dead can rest, advise, and when grievous need demands, fight again in bodies of shaped thought. Wraith Guard, Wraith Lords, machines that are not quite machines, animated by those who once painted, gardened, and loved. Elsewhere, the price was paid differently. Comera, the greatest metropolis hidden in the branching dark of the webway, survived the initial cataclysm because its walls were not in the open sea of the warp, but its people felt the thirst immediately. For them, the solution was not to bottle the soul against the future, but to feed it in the present. Pain, terror, ecstasy, these became currencies. By inflicting and consuming distilled sensations on others, the denizens of the Dark City could repair the slow, constant leakage of their essence towards she who thirsts. The Drukhari were born into that accounting. They did not fall from grace. They pivoted, fully conscious, to a model of survival that externalizes cost. The Eye did more than devour Eldar. It changed the galaxy's weather. Warp storms that had choked human expansion for millennia abated in the aftermath, the tides of the Immaterium settling into new patterns. On distant Terra, an emperor who had been trapped by those storms found a corridor of opportunity and launched a great crusade. This is not merely a timeline curiosity. It means the Eldar catastrophe and humanity's sudden age of conquest are causally linked. One species' end state of hubris became another's opening. For the craftworld Eldar, the Asuryani to themselves, doctrine hardened out of shock. The path system was no longer an experiment, it became law and lifeline. An Eldar would become a seer, a warrior, an artisan, an outcast ranger by choice and, for a time, walking that identity as a channel, then stepping away from it before it could become a compulsion. The aim was not asceticism for its own sake, it was survival engineering at the level of personality. Councils of Farseers learned to read futures not to find victory, but to avoid outcomes where victory costs too much. Autarchs learned to assemble strategies like mosaics, borrowing facets from warriors who had lived many paths. Shrines to the aspect warriors, fighting as disciplined embodiment of a single martial ideal, emerged as a way to make war safe for the soul. The Harlequins' role intensified. They moved between enclaves as librarians and police of memory, maintaining myths not as nostalgia but as active countermeasures. They spoke of Rana Dandra, the last battle, but not as an excuse to hasten it, as a calibration of stakes. They protected gates and tunnels within the webway because if those arteries were compromised, nothing anyone had built would matter. None of this undid what had happened. The Crone worlds remained inside the Eye, bitter monuments to a perfection that overheated. The dead remained at risk if their stones were lost or their circuits shattered. The Drukhari remained a parallel answer to the same problem, raiding the real space they disdained to feed a hunger that had mastery over them. The Asuryani remained disciplined, brilliant and few. Every child born was a victory and a promise to pay attention. In Eldar histories, the fall reads like a singular disaster. In their lives, it behaves more like weather. It is not over. It is the climate in which they exist. Every strategy, military feint, political bargain, cultural norm is tuned to that climate. Limit exposure, disperse risk, conserve essence, never give the enemy what it wants most. They are capable of acts of beauty that would shame gods, and they are governed by the knowledge that an unguarded moment can cost more than a battle. This is the paradox the Fall forged. A people who once tried to feel everything now stay alive by choosing what they will allow themselves to be.
We were born into the war in heaven, the war with no victors. Yet, we survived. We thrived. We ruled for uncountable eons. This galaxy was ours, and we threw it away. In an excess of hedonism that tore reality apart, we birthed a dark god, into whose maw our people leapt.
After the detonation of their empire, the Asuryani did not rebuild cities so much as they engineered a way of being. Survival became a disciplined practice at the level of the individual mind, the household, the council, and the craft world itself. What appears from the outside as cold formality is, from within, a pressure suit for the soul. At the heart of this culture is the path, a lattice of specialized callings that narrows the self on purpose. A citizen chooses a path and lives inside it completely, until the work is done and the lessons are metabolized. The path of the artisan trains the hand and the eye until intention can convince Wraithbone to grow into bridges and hulls. The path of the seer teaches a grammar for probability, humility in the presence of futures, and the ethics of intervention. The path of the warrior hardens attention into a blade, and then sheaths it again before it seals around the psyche. Every path has subpaths and deep lineages. An Asuryani can spend a century teaching the breath of the bone singer or learning the mathematics of rune casting, and still be thought early in their study. None of this is asceticism for its own sake. The point is to compartmentalize intensity so it does not flood the whole personality, to experience mastery without letting mastery define you. Failure has a name. Some never step away. On the martial road, these are the exarchs, warriors who have fused so completely with their aspect that they become living repositories of technique and memory. They are both guardians and warnings, anchors for their temples and reminders that the path's promise can become a trap. Elsewhere, those who drift between paths without returning to communal rhythms become outcasts, leaving the lanes of the craft world to walk the stars as rangers and corsairs. Their independence a valve the society tolerates because it has learned, painfully, that pressure must escape somewhere. Every Asuryani wears at their breast a spirit stone, a psychoreactive crystal tuned to the individual's resonance. At death, the stone pulls the departing soul away from the gravity well of she who thirsts, storing it so it can be returned to the craft world's infinity circuit. This circuit is not metaphor. It is a physical, living network of wraithbone veins that threads the hull and halls. A distributed chorus that houses the dead, supports the living, advises the seers, and can, when need deepens into desperation, lend strength to animate wraith constructs for war. The circuit is culture materialized, remembrance, counsel, and continuity arranged not as monuments but as infrastructure. Craft worlds raid the most dangerous vaults in existence, the crown worlds entombed within the eye, to harvest fresh waystone crystal when their reserves run low, paying blood today so their children will have a tomorrow to return to. Seers and warlocks sit at the junction between duty and taboo. Farseers, who walk the deepest parts of the seer's path, cast runes from wraithbone and read their fall as a language of pressure gradients in time. They do not seek the best future. They stalk the least catastrophic viable route and then sculpt events so the species arrives there with enough intact to continue. Warlocks are a different alloy, former aspect warriors who later took up the witch path, carrying the discipline fury of battle into the discipline of mind. In the council, they temper prophecy with the memory of blood. On the field, they project runes of protection and disillusion while moving with the fighter's economy. Civic mirrors the personal architecture. The autarch is not a tyrant but a synthesis. A commander who has walked multiple aspects and paths, understands their idioms and can combine them into strategies that spend lives sparingly. The citizen soldiers, guardians, do not live for war. They train so that when war arrives, the craft world can survive it without sacrificing the adults who keep its art, agriculture, and industry functional. Bone singers grow civic space in ships with choral craft. Shrine keepers maintain the disciplines of the warrior path. War hosts are raised and dispersed with the same clinical care that keeps the infinity circuit healthy. In this society, elegance is not an affect. It is the ergonomics of endurance. Everything the Asuryani do domestically, education, celebration, mourning, is tuned to two truths. Their souls have predators, and beauty without boundaries killed their ancestors. The result is a people who can be shockingly warm in private and ceremonially remote in public, who will host a rite of spring in a greenhouse cathedral and, a day later, quietly prepare the waystones of the unborn. If the path is the inner architecture, the aspect temples are its armories. The warrior path is a controlled burn, not licensed to kill. Each aspect is a distilled battle philosophy, a mastodon and set aside. Dire avengers hold the discipline line. Howling banshees deliver shock and terror with keening helms. Striking scorpions are patient, crushing ambush. Fire dragons end armor at knife range. Swooping hawks turn altitude into harassment and map control. Dark reapers deny ground with perfect fire. Rarer esoteric aspects widen the grammar while quarantining violence from the self. At the root stand the Phoenix Lords, reliquary wallsuits heavy with spirit stones that reconstitute a composite champion when worn. Asaman, Jane Zar, Karandris, Fugan, Baharoth, Mugen Ra, method made immortal to reassure initiates they inherit discipline, not bloodlust. The path's danger is real. Exarchs fuse permanently to an aspect lead shrines, their wall mask never fully unclenches. In battle they are lodestones that let squads move as one. In peace, unnerving reminders of the line between mastery and fixation, yet indispensable living tutors. Strategy begins in domes and councils, not musters. Farseers prune futures to the least catastrophic course. Autarchs braid aspect hosts, guardians, jetbike lancers, and wraith formations to remove only what would ruin tomorrow. Guardian defenders anchor lines with platforms, storm guardians convert civilian steadiness into sudden close-quarters force. Wind riders and shining spears redraw space with speed. Falcons and wave serpents tax the elites precisely. Night spinners and fire prisms rewrite terrain. As a last resort, a shard of a god wakes. In a forge-like chamber, the avatar of Kayla Mensha Kane rises, roused by rite and the young king's sacrifice. Terror weapon and a rallying point, and a mirror to the Asuryani dislike. The same people who crafted paths carry a war god in their marrow. When it walks, restraint is failed somewhere. When it cools, the craftworlds count the cost and recommits to paying it rarely. Asuryani tech is thought made tool, no hard line between machine and magic. Everything rests on wraithbone, sung into form by bone singers, so ships, halls, and doors answer intention. A craftworld is a living artifact with citizens. The webway, sealed, insulated arteries through the immaterium, makes this life possible. Gates stand in gardens, hangars, atria, and ravines. The network is neither infinite nor safe. Collapsed passages, parasitic annexes, pirate ports, forbidden sanctums, but the Asuryani relate to it proprietarily, not desperately. It shapes strategy and economics. Battlefields appear wherever hidden gates exist. Retreats are a step sideways. Somewhere within lies the black library of the Harlequins, occasionally open to seers who need a story older than their maps. Weapons bend rules at the edges so the foe breaks first. Shuriken catapults shear with monomolecular storms. Bright lances pinch space through armor. Prism cannons stack coherent light like geometry on fire. Distortion weapons momentarily make a target elsewhere. Holofields and vector engines turn aim into hypothesis. Runes etched into airframes and armor calm turbulence around pilots and plates. Wraithcraft fuses cult and craft. Souls drawn by spirit stones into the infinity circuit can, with consent and right, animate Wraithguard, Wraith Lords and Titanic Wraith Knights, the last a duet between a living pilot and a bonded soul, often a twin. This is duty extended across death, strength without spending tomorrow's children. Motion follows the same ethic. Star engines, sails, and graphitic veins ride pressures. Rings and spires sail the void. Crimson hunters embody pursuit. Hemlocks unman foes with witch silence. Nothing here is casual. The webway is maintained, wraithbone grown clean, runes carved because centuries prove they work. A war host appears, removes the variable a seer warned would flower into disaster and vanishes, leaving only contrails and an enemy commander wondering why the plan now feels like a closed room. To outsiders, this reads as arrogance. It is control as sacrament. Paths prevent self-sabotage. Aspects let them wage war without inviting it home. The webway avoids gambles they cannot afford. Wraithcraft gives the dead purpose and the living hope. At their best, the Asuryani remain what they have always been, makers of vessels, strategies, and selves, fighting to keep making possible.
We are but the lingering mote of a golden empire. We will burn that flame brightly as long as we can. We have carried it to Gladius Prime. There, the schemes of fate meet. There is woven our future. There, we will solve its mystery.
Comera, also known as the Dark City, is a verdict passed on a civilization. It stretches through parasitic annexes of the webway like frost on old pipework, a labyrinth of stolen horizons and spires that were never built to hold honest light. Here the Drukhari perfected the only survival model that made sense to those who refused repentance. If Slaanesh drains the soul, then the soul must be refilled, daily, brutally, transactionally. Everything in the Dark City follows from that arithmetic. The skyline tells the story. High Commera rises in needle towers and serrated balconies where the great cabals hold court, each a cartel state with its own armories, hangars, flesh vaults and slave exchanges. Archons reign by paranoia and spectacle, their rule measured in how cleanly they orchestrate betrayal. Below them and between them run arterial streets where Wychers parade their brands toward amphitheaters and arenas, where coven retinues hold quiet crates that pulse at the corners with muffled screams, where raider crews idle with one eye on the sky for a rival's opening gambit. These are districts that exist for one night, their architecture printed out of sensory demand and dissolved when the party ends. Their obliques are so old that the names have worn off their doors, and there are sky lanes so new that their legal ownership is simply the answer to the question, who can shoot the most witnesses? This is not chaos without form. Drukhari society is more precise than that. It is divided into mutually dependent predators. The Cabals, Poisoned Tongue, Blackheart, Flayed Skull and countless others are the spear points and syndicates, holding the skimmers and gunships, contracting raids, trafficking slaves and material across the webway's black markets. They fight wars that are seconds long, portal breaches, lightning harvests, clean exfiltration. The Wyche cults are the city's public theater and private religion, converting the raw material of captive fear and blood into a refined distillate. Their arenas are ecosystems. Every fight is framed to excite, to crest, to crash. Every gasp and shriek feeds circuits in the vaults beneath the sand. Succubi are choreographers of slaughter, whose creed is attention as power, and whose currency is a crowd's unblinking stare. The homunculi covens are older and colder. They are the city's undertakers and resurrectionists, its biologists and engineers, a priesthood of morphic craft that treats anatomy as clay. They craft pain engines, Talos and Kronos, that chew and sip essence by the amphora, and grow homunculi and grotesques from vats with the same tenderness a bone singer reserves for a cathedral arch. Their masters, Raykarth and his rivals, claim to keep personal ledgers of every soul they've ever rebuilt, a library of favors that no one dares to audit. All of it serves the economy that keeps the Dark City alive. In the wake of the fall, the Drukhari discovered that they could slow the drain of their essence by feeding on the suffering of others. Terror, agony, ecstasy, harvested and drunk as tinctures, or simply inhaled on the spot in a hot theater of blood. Raiders bring home the crop, tumbrils of slaves, data cores with coordinates for future harvests, artifacts that can be tuned to tease more flavor from a scream. Cabals barter captives with cults for billing in the season's grand combats. Covens buy the leftovers by the kilogram and sell back perfect copies of flavored killers to the Cabals who lost them last week. Archons keep their shadows close and their allies closer, knowing that alliances in Commera are formalities for murder delayed, and over it all hangs a simple truth that Drukhari will not say aloud. This works. It is cruel, and it is a machine that eats everyone eventually. But it keeps the city's population largely intact across millennia, in which their cousins must carve crystals from tomb worlds just to let their dead sleep. Real space raids are Commera's harvest festivals. The timing is chosen by astrologies of appetite, moments when a planet's defenses blink, when a convoy's escorts drift a little wider than doctrine, when the prey is rich and likely to panic well. Portals peel open and skimmers shriek out. Splinter fire turns air into mirrored hail. Dark light weapons write black equations through armor. Shadow fields flicker like bad memories. The point is not conquest, it is rhythm. Shock, rupture, penetration of social order. The proof, too, watching cabals that this Archon still has it. Captives are netted and tagged, choice specimens destined for a Wyche cult's marquee. Others earmarked for coven labs whose waiting lists run to centuries. The raiders are gone in minutes. The victimized worlds write myths to explain the night, and Commera updates its menus. Names concentrate this culture's logic. Astrubal Vect, the Archon who built the Cabal of the Black Heart into a hegemony, learned that control of the webway's choke points is control of the city's metabolism. Whoever can tax portal usage can starve rivals. Lilith Hesperak's shadow falls across every arena as a geometry lesson in how the human eye understands speed. Urian Raykarth's clinics teach that suffering can be frozen, rewarmed and plated anew. Drazar walks through arguments and leaves conclusions. None of them solve the city's moral equation, they embody it. There is a sincerity to the Drukhari that the Asuryani find obscene. The Dark City makes no apology, offers no theology beyond the avoidance of the fate that hunts every Eldar. They are alive because someone else is not, and tomorrow they will be alive again because they will arrange the same exchange. In a universe where both sentimentality and nihilism gets you killed, Chimera is something worse, competent.
We regret nothing. Only the weaklings were swallowed. Only the craftworld fools stepped back. We learned and adapted, tormented the cattle race to prolong our days. In chaos, like Gladius Prime, we glory, we raid, kill, take. Aeldari, we are no more. Today we are Drukhari.
Between craftworld decorum and Chimera's hunger, there moves a third current, faster and stranger than either. The Harlequins answer to no banner but the last unfettered god of the Aeldari, Segarak, the Laughing One, and their warfare looks, to anyone not watching carefully, like theatre that forgot it was supposed to end when the curtain fell. To the Harlequins, the stage is a weapon and memories artillery. They fight so that a story survives, and they keep the story sharp enough to cut demons. Their origin is a punchline delivered in a burning room. When Slaanesh woke and Cain shattered, when Isha was taken and Fall changed, Segarak slipped sideways into the webway with a grin and a promise. There would be no second Fall on his watch. In his wake coalesced the masks, troops and companies whose members adopt roles older than their own names. The troop master is director in Blade in One. Players become avatars of archetypes from the Aeldari's living myth cycle. Shadow seers shape mindscape with hallucination and counter-hex, turning battlefields into stages where only the Harlequin knows the script. Death jesters are one-man tragedies, punctuation marks in bone. Hollow suits ripple with bad possibilities. Flip belts make gravity a suggestion. Caresses and embraces hide monomolecular endings. A Star Weaver arrives like the second act and leaves, if there is time, like an encore. They travel freely among the Aeldari not because they are beloved, but because they are necessary. Craftworld gates open for them even when councils are closed to cousins. Chimera's vipers sheath fangs and offer a box when a mask takes a bow in their district. Harlequins carry no rancor from those audiences. They are Segarak's auditors, and their currency is attention. When a mask performs the fall on a craftworld concourse, it is not nostalgia. The choreography is a ritual that keeps the narrative scaffold of the species intact, a prophylaxis against the kind of cultural amnesia that got them killed the first time. When a mask performs the war in heaven for a Drukhari crowd, it is not entertainment. It is a mirror held up to predators who think they cannot be prey. Both leave payment behind, a warning, a favor, a mark on a gate that will open when nothing else will. Their small walls are constant and mostly invisible. They hunt demons in the webway's unlit annexes because if those things take root, the arteries everyone uses will clot. They interdict cults and warbands in real space that smell like stage setting for greater ruin. They will appear beside a Farseer's dais uninvited and offer a single line that simplifies a nightmare equation, an angle of approach, a name, a timing, because the laughing god prefers comedy where the joke lands on the right skull. They have friends because they are useful, and enemies because they have never once paused their performance to ask permission. One figure stands apart even among these singular lives, the solitaire. In the great mask of the fall, someone must play Slaanesh, and tradition insists that the part be taken fully. Solitaires walk alone, outside troop loyalty and outside the protections Segarak extends to his faithful. Their souls are promised at the end of their run. They dance with a god that eats dancers. Legends insist the laughing god will steal them back at the last instant with a trick he refuses to explain. On the field, solitaires move like an argument you cannot refute. They end keystones, champions, psychers, commanders, and are gone before grief takes hold. Harlequin technology obeys aesthetic as much as doctrine. Everything bends perception. Hollow fields generate probabilities that the eye cannot resolve. Prismatic cannons and neurodisruptors rewrite a target's confidence before they end its life. Skyweavers carve calligraphy through anti-air fire, and leave in their wake pilots who swear they saw a dozen bikes where there were only two. Void Weavers deliver the parting lines, but their most potent asset is still the script, codices of performance and prophecy that function like map and manual in one. Somewhere in the deep maze of the webway lies the Black Library, guarded by masks who will kill to prevent the wrong reader from learning a sentence too early. The Harlequins will open a page to an Asuryani seer who asks with the right humility, or slam the door on a corsair prince who arrives with the wrong smile. The Laughing War is not about victory, it is about timing. Segarak's blessing is a punchline delivered at the only moment it can change the ending. Not all Aeldari survived by doubling down on control or consumption. Some stepped off the stage entirely and built quieter rooms from which to watch the fire. The Exodites and the corsairs stand at the opposite edges of that choice, one rooted, one restless. But together they trace a boundary around what it still means to be Eldar. The Exodites left before the scream. They were the minority who took the seers seriously, while the capital worlds laughed, who judged that proximity to splendor was itself a contagion. They sailed not for other metropoles, but for worlds fit to be gardens again, maiden worlds seeded in the long ago by their forebears, places where continents were tuned to Eldar biology and geology hum with buried wraithbone. There they built clan holds rather than spires, learning the weights of seasons and the temper of soils for the first time in longer than anyone remembered. Their technology did not vanish, it was recontextualized. Wraithbone became hedge and home, spirit wells spread through the bedrock to receive the dead in a planetary analogue of an infinity circuit. Saurian megafauna were not tamed so much as met halfway, dragon knights riding living tanks that would sooner die than let a rider fall. The Exodites' warcraft looks primitive to anyone who has forgotten that a lance of coherent light and a lance couched in a saddle can both remake a battle's arithmetic if used where the ground conspires with you. They pay for their peace with vigilance. Human colonists arrive with plows and surveys and the best intentions, and are sent away because a maiden world cannot host a species with souls that burn the warp like greenwood. Orc spawns fall in the wrong valley and become a season of blood. Tyrannid feeders drift a little too close, and clan councils accept that this year's festival will be a levy instead. Craft worlds honor their stubborn cousins with quiet support. Seed stock, advice, a squadron of jet bikes that just happen to be passing. The Exodites honor the gesture by not becoming dependent on it. They are part of the species that chose fewer notes in exchange for a melody they could keep, and the rest of the Aeldari look to them the way city dwellers look to lighthouse keepers, with gratitude and a bit of guilt. Corsairs, by contrast, are what happens when the past strictures fit like a borrowed coat. They are outcasts in the literal sense, rangers who never came back, artisans who discovered they preferred Starwind to workshop air, Asuryani who wanted more velocity between selves than a council was prepared to condone, Comorites who grew bored of watching their city eat everyone they knew. They gather in coteries under princes and barons with names that read like jokes and oaths, painting their hulls in colors their more solemn cousins would call inadvisable. They trade in information, relics, favors, and sudden violence. Their fleets stitch together Asuryani elegance and Drukhari menace, shuriken and splinter, prism and blaster, sails that whisper through webway shoals, and armor that flickers with stolen shadow field tricks. They fight like weather fronts, rolling in, unbalancing everything, and rolling out with a laugh and a cargo that will pay for another year. Corsair loyalties are transactional, but not empty. Some serve as deniable hands for craft worlds that need a task done without the strain of official sanction. Others sell themselves to human rogue traders on the understanding that the first lie will be the last one heard. A few keep long truces with particular masks, ferrying players to stages no gate can reach. Every Asuryani council has a story about a corsair prince whose timely treachery saved a craft world. Every Drukhari archon has a scar from a corsair who decided the price had changed. Prince Ariel's legend, autarch and privateer, savior in exile, proves the point. Piracy is a career. identity is more complicated. Corsairs and Exodites share one thing their louder kin sometimes forget. They are escape valves for a species that cannot afford pressure to build in straight lines. The Exodite clanholds absorb restlessness by translating it into stewardship, ride the hills, mend the world spirits, keep the festivals honest. The Corsair flotilla absorbs it by giving it an outlet that harms neither circuit nor city. Fly, fight, steal, vanish, come home later if you can, and if you cannot, at least you spent your soul on something that felt like motion rather than attrition. Both remind the Aeldari of truths they cannot erase, however carefully they engineer themselves. A people this long-lived need places to set burdens down, and roads that do not end at a shrine.
Your ancestors are saved. The humans shall pour more blood onto the ashes, and the newborn Tau shall stagger bloody from the stage.
Every Aeldari solution after the fall has been a compromise with fear. The Ynnari are the first to propose a solution that is also a confrontation. Their thesis is simple to state and shattering to accept. The only way past Slaanesh is through her. Awaken Ynnead, the gestalt of the Aeldari dead, shape that newborn power into a god of endings, and set it against the god of indulgence that hunts them. It is not a reform, it is a wager with a species' entire afterlife on the table. The movement coheres around three figures. Yvraine, once a creature of Comoraz arenas and intrigues, dies and returns bearing the breath of the Whispering God. She is the voice, equal parts preacher, diplomat, and knife, whose presence turns funerary rites into recruitment drives. The visage is the sword at her shoulder, a principled killer sculpted by a dozen courts, whose loyalty is not blind but absolute once given. The Incarn is doctrine made flesh, an avatar of Ynnead that condenses where death gathers thickest, a silent storm that fights like inevitability. The symbol they fly is unity under a new eschatology. The reality is a coalition that should not exist. Craftworld exiles, Drukhari schismatics, Harlequin troops, even Corsair captains who prefer purpose to drift, moving together because the alternative is millennia of slow bleed. The birth pangs of this belief are written into a craftworld's bones. Biel-Tan's infinity circuit fractures during the first great surge of Ynnari ritual. Souls venting as light and lament while the Incarn steps through like a reply. To some Asuryani this is desecration, to others proof that the math works. In Comora, Archons smile with all their teeth and plot Yvraine's vivisection. Not because they doubt her power, but because her success would end the only economy that has ever kept their city alive. Among the masks, some troops become the movement's couriers and wardens, convinced that the laughing god enjoys a joke told at Apocalypse's expense. Others stay aloof, unwilling to weld one more destiny onto a species that already carries too many. Strategically, the Ynnari push on two lines at once. One is metaphysical, rites and artifacts set to link the species scattered dead into a choir that can sing a god awake. The other is political, campaign staged to prove that rebirth through death is more than rhetoric. Their hosts borrow talent without demanding conversion. Aspect shrines marching alongside incubi phalanxes, white blades opening lanes for Wraithguard to cross, a solitaire arriving unannounced to scythe a linchpin and depart without bow or explanation. On the field, the doctrine expresses as timing. When lives end near them, their warriors accelerate, calm hardens, strikes land with a precision that reads like choreography. It is not simple bloodlust, it is a ritual economy where sacrifice unlocks agency for the survivors. Why is this salvation risky? Well, because it retools the most sacred boundary the Aeldari possess. Spirit stones and infinity circuits were designed to keep the dead safe from predation and let the living remember without consumption. The Ynnari ask those same souls to fight again at a scale that dwarfs wraith hosts and guardianship, and because awakening gods in the warp is not engineering, it is gardening under a hostile sky. A victory that creates a new appetite would be a different kind of death. Yet the movement grows because the alternative, eternal defensive war against entropy in a carnivore deity, is simply a slower failure. The Ynnari promise an ending that writes a future, not a eulogy. Whether the species can endure the cost of that punctuation is the open question they force everyone else to answer. Ultimately, the Aeldari all wear their ruins like architecture. Tragedy isn't mood, but design constraint. A people tuned to feel too keenly learn that sensation without boundaries summons a predator.
Your craft world burns, alien. Your warriors bleed. Your people die this day.
How proud you must be of your ability to inflict atrocity.
For the Emperor!